Midnight Confessions. Written by Shaihara. Read by Arashi. If you were to focus your eyes on the sky, you'd be in awe. An imperfectly bold baby blue drenched the sky, whilst woolly candy floss clouds leisurely soared across the atmosphere, aimlessly dotted around like a painter creating a work of art. That simple sight really could easily be mistaken for an artist's perfect piece. An electrifying royal blue gradient painted the calming sea. Accents of pearly white simmer as the sunshine beamed down onto the reflective but distorted surface. On days like these, you could often see crowds of people bunched up in confined, open spaces, not a single soul wanting to let this day go to waste. School kids on their half-terms were seen out and about with their chosen ones, building sandcastles, having water fights, and just mucking around in general. Parents laid back in their beach chairs as they soaked up the warmth of the day, hoping to get that summer glow. Chocolate, vanilla, strawberry, cookie dough, mint chocolate chip, caramel, common flavors of ice cream you would see in the hands of strangers as they looked to cool down. The frozen food often taking little to no time to melt down the sides of the wafer cone, creating an all-familiar mess in their hands. Not too far from the shoreline, soft melodies could be heard on top of a small yacht's highest deck, an equally gentle voice humming and singing over the lyrics of a relaxing song. The source of latter came from none other than a boy named Kokichi Oma, a small old teen with dark purple hair and skin paler than ice white. The young male had his slim fingers wrapped around a pint glass of Panta, whilst the other had carefully tucked itself behind his head. His slender figure was mostly shielded from the sun by a humongous beach umbrella he had put up to protect himself, and his knees and everything below couldn't be saved from the heat of the sunshine's rays. That disgusting cream, sunscreen, being wiped on for his own safety. Across the deck were a few of his friends. One was a girl named Kaede Akamatsu. She was the ultimate pianist, but Kokichi thinks she should really be the ultimate enthusiastic person instead. The girl practically bursted with optimistic thoughts and enthusiastic words, usually bringing a sense of hope into people's hearts. It was disgustingly nice. Beside her was a boy, his name being Shuichi Saihara. Kokichi liked to think that, physically, he and the ultimate detective were quite similar. Slim frame, pale skin, with faces often perceived as tired, with bags under their eyes. Being an ultimate supreme leader was tiring, he'll think you'll find. Both had decided to stay on the boat, whilst the other two, Kaito Momota and Maki Harukawa, had left the boat some time ago, the ultimate astronaut wanting to explore this new area, whilst the ultimate assassin flatly said she would go so he wouldn't get lost or killed. Kaede had given her those eyes, whilst Shuichi had simply nodded, agreeing that it was a good idea for someone to keep an eye on their joyous, but stupid, friend. And the final one was Rantaro Amami, the most interesting and most important one of the group, in Kokichi's opinion. He was the ultimate adventurer, and had been on a quest to find his obscene amount of missing sisters, all unfortunately scattered around the world, in either well-established countries or little islands no one had ever heard about. 12 sisters in total, 8 currently still missing. At the beginning, Rantaro's trips were simple and strictly a solo mission. It wasn't a surprise to everyone after their first few months of attending Hope's Peak to see Rantaro one day and then never see him again for a continuously fluctuating amount of time. Sometimes it was only a few days. Sometimes it was literal months. 3 had been the most to this day. When they had all graduated from Hope's Peak Academy, Rantaro had already planned all of his trips. He was going to each and every single country his sisters had been last seen in until he found them. He didn't care if this took months, years, or even decades. He wanted to fix his broken past. He wanted to see his sisters. What he wasn't 100% sure about was having a group of friends tag along with him. At first it was only Kokichi, even if the adventurer tried to convince the boy it wasn't a good idea to come with him, nor safe. It would be like he was talking to a wall. Rantaro still wasn't sure how that initial one extra person he thought was tagging along turned into 5, though he had been rather grateful for Shuichi's help from a safe distance. He had been the driving factor for finding his third sister, after all. Even so, that was how things planned out to make this day a reality. Rantaro had docked up in a harbor by one of Spain's many beaches, specifically Barcelona, early in the morning, making his exit onto the foreign land almost immediately. It was nothing new, but Kokichi sometimes wished that Rantaro would be free for a day occasionally. He knew how important his sisters were, but you could see how it was internally, and even externally, tearing him down and wearing him out. It was quite upsetting to witness, if Kokichi were honest. Rantaro really was driving himself into the ground, for guilt that he shouldn't even be feeling. Did his dad feel the same guilt? Kokichi already knew the answer. If he had, he would be here too, wouldn't he? Laying down in this Spanish paradise felt wrong when you acknowledged the reasoning behind the visit. It almost felt a little wrong. Perhaps you could say the same thing about him and the others that tagged along on this personal issue, but Kokichi was doing it for Rantaro's sake, not for a free holiday. With that in mind, Kokichi grabbed that stupidly big hat from underneath his chair, pressed a finger to the little button on his cassette player. Stolen, but technically now his. Besides, that random rich man wouldn't miss this silly old thing. He totally wasn't distraught. Okay, Kokichi would return it when he was home, he promises. Or is that a lie? You would never know. Getting off the boat seemed like a good idea anyways. Not only was there the beautiful city of Barcelona to explore, the constant fluctuating rocking motion was making his stomach churn. From past experiences on this trip, he knew that was a sign he needed to get the fuck off before he ended up having to spend the next few hours sleeping with a fan on. Oddly specific, he knows. He quietly yawned with a stretch, rubbing his eyes in an attempt to see clearer. "Going for an exploration?" he registered Kaede asking, simply nodding his head as an answer to her inquiry. "Don't forget to be back before sunset. We'll let you know if we go anywhere." With a little thumbs up and a water balloon thrown in her face, Kaede's shrieking was absolutely hilarious, Shuichi just sighing in disappointment. Kokichi descended from the top deck of the boat onto the lower quarters so he could leave. His feet created a light tapping sound as he walked along the walkway, oak planks creaking as he made his way towards and onto the sandy beach. Kokichi, if he were completely honest for once, didn't understand much Spanish. Only simple phrases like hola or ¿qué would register in his mind. Something more complex was lost on him the moment someone spoke. Realistically speaking, it was evident that leaving by himself was yet another poor decision. With the language barrier between him and the locals, it would become quite challenging for him to navigate through the streets of Barcelona. Perhaps he would be okay, though. All he has to do is keep track of which paths he takes, and then he'll be sorted. Or maybe this was just Kaede and Kaito's toxic positivity rubbing off on him. How repulsive. In next to no time, the small boy found himself lost in the bustling, congested streets in the city, next to what felt like thousands upon thousands of busy shops, squeezed together so tightly to the point where they might explode like a firework. The majority of them looked like shops for tourists, cafes, and your typical corner store. Having some spare change on him, Kokichi decided to buy himself a drink. A granizado, to be more accurate. He totally butchered the pronunciation when he walked up to the counter. He was almost certain that this was a Spanish version of your typical slush puppy. After all, It was just flavored blended ice, and it sure did taste like one. Even so, he couldn't put his finger on what the flavor was. It was blue, so he had automatically assumed it was blue raspberry. But even after taking a sip of the Spanish beverage, he still wasn't sure. In fact, it gave him more questions than answers. After more mindless wandering around, street after street, block after block, Kokichi found himself pondering about what he should do next. He had gone too long without causing some sort of mischief, so perhaps he could do that. Though he knew it wouldn't feel the same without his dice members. Perhaps he could leave his mark in Spain. He was more than open to the idea of having his organization become a worldwide hit. He did consider going on his own adventures to try and find the literal adventurer, but he wasn't even sure where to start. He wonders what Rantaro is up to right now. He hopes to see him again before the end of the day. So, as he gathered supplies for the vandalism, Kokichi let his mind wander, the same greenette still living in his head rent-free. Kokichi had a lot of questions about him, most of them still being unanswered. He wanted to know why Rantaro was such a mystery, why he didn't like opening up to people. Had losing his sisters affected him to the point where he was simply scared of losing others, of the possibility of living through the same scenario again and again, even after 19 years? Kokichi wondered if the others suffered from PTSD or something similar to that. He doesn't know if this situation is traumatic enough, but with how distressed Rantaro looks whenever his own mask falls, bawling out all of his pent-up feelings, perhaps Kokichi would ask him once this is all over, or subtly hint at it. The Supreme Leader also wonders how on earth Rantaro is still single. I mean, have you seen him? He's almost perfect. Well, no, he is perfect. There was no almost about it. He had delicate, deep green eyes, almost like they were inviting you to get lost deep into them. His teal-green hair, messily covering half his face most of the time, watched him drag his fingers through it, becoming an obsession for Kokichi. It just looked so soft. He wanted to know how it properly felt. His silver accessorized ears, his ring-covered fingers, his leather-banded wrist. This guy was basically a whole entire section in a clothing shop, and the worst thing about it was how hot he made all of it look. Kokichi had never seen someone with such a substantial amount of piercings and not look completely stupid or weird. No offense, but take offense. The boy snapped out of his thoughts as he stared at the rather detailed dice logo he sprayed onto the wall, hands holding his hips. It looked pretty good, actually. This seemed like a great way of promoting dice. If he were to show the others how amazing his organization was, it would certainly attract more potential members. Soon enough, he knew he would be seeing more of these logos. Dice was actually well known, in a way, if you really thought about it, but mostly in his homeland of Japan. But hey, you never know. Maybe this will be on the news and the word will spread. Perhaps he should ask his second-in-command to do something about this. Happy with the way he marked his new territory, Kokichi disposed of the evidence that pointed this crime towards him, walking back onto the street as if he had done nothing. The crowds hid his presence, weaving in and out of different side roads to get as far as possible. He didn't know how serious the Spanish police took these sorts of things, but judging by what he's seen, he doesn't want to get caught. From blue to, fittingly, Spanish orange, a day that most would call flawless, was coming to an end in what felt like mere seconds. Kokichi doesn't even know how he was out for this long. A minute ago, he could have sworn it was still lunchtime. He did know, however, that he needed to get back to the boat, and quickly. Like Kaede had mentioned, he needed to get back before sunset, and judging by the shading of the sky, which was more than beautiful, might he add, it was getting dangerously close to that time of the day. It had become a rule ever since Kaede got lost on the way back to the boat, and didn't arrive back until midnight. Rantaro had been visibly anxious the entire time, pacing back and forth between a few set points. He looked more than relieved to see her. A part of his soul just had to give her a bit of a lecture. Kaede hadn't complained, and simply apologized with words and a hug. An unspoken rule, but a rule nonetheless. Kokichi ended up returning to his temporary floating home before the sun had been concealed by the horizon, a sigh of relief leaving his lips. Though he couldn't see Rantaro currently, a part of him was scared he would turn a corner to see the greenette panicking. After doing a quick sweep of the boat, Kokichi realized that he was actually the only one here. A note in the door of their bedrooms was left, addressed to him. "Hey, Kokichi. Just wanted to let you know that we've gone to that restaurant we were talking about earlier. You're welcome to join us if you like. Also, if you hear from Rantaro, let us know. He's not returned or responded. Shuichi." Though he did contemplate joining them for a dinner, Kokichi wasn't entirely hungry, and decided that he would wait on the boat instead. Besides, if Rantaro wasn't back, at least he would be there to inform him of the other's whereabouts. Kokichi took this time he had alone to return his belongings back to his suite, wanting to keep the boat tidy. Though he was a complete wreck everywhere else, Kokichi wanted to keep his friend's boat tidy. Not only was it the polite thing to do, but he also didn't want to lose any of his things to the wind. Also, knowing him, he would leave it on the top deck, only for it to go flying off once Rantaro set sail for a whole new country. That sounded like it was quite possibly one of the most stupidest and worst ways to lose a personal item. It had only been perhaps 5 minutes after Kokichi had finished moving everything into a much safer place, and yet he was already dead asleep. A gentle snoring could be heard, along with the TV playing some random show. Was it a cartoon? Yes. Did he care? No. Judge him all you like. He'd sit here and watch kids' programs all he wants. Ugh, adults and responsibilities, neither of which Kokichi liked. When his eyes had fluttered open for the first time during the night, and slotted his existence back into the world again, it was some time around the early hours of the morning. The warm colors of the sky had been replaced by a flat, dark blue, almost black shade of mirrored pigment on the ocean's surface, the distant horizon only visible by the hidden light beyond it. Kokichi had yawned, turning over on the comfort of his woolen blanket, bones cracking and popping, lazily lifting his head to check the actual time. In bright red lights, the time on his clock illuminated 12:27 in the morning, a light sigh leaving the room owner's lips. One of the many downsides of sleeping at an earlier time. You wake up early, and tired, and bored. Not even bothering to try, the Supreme Leader was very nearly 100% sure that he wouldn't be falling back into the universe where your dreams come true, even if he were to constantly attempt to. Assuming that it would cause no harm to himself or the people around him, Kokichi sluggishly sat up and left his room. He wasn't going to leave the boat. Oh, gods no, Kokichi wasn't that idiotic, but escorting himself to another section of the premises might be a pleasant way to clear his brain. Palm loosely holding the handle, Kokichi was a fraction of a second off from leaving before he came to an abrupt halt behind the door. At first glance, Kokichi had thought that there was a complete stranger on the decking of the boat, readying a shout to his friends about his slightly anxiety-inducing discovery. But, after a second glance, and a quick inspection of the figure that stood there, he recognized that all-familiar teal-green hair. It was none other than Rantaro. He wondered what the boy was doing at this hour. He hadn't seen him all of yesterday, so the fact that he was still awake was a little concerning. Had he even slept at all? Or, perhaps, could he just not fall asleep either? Whatever the answer was, Kokichi planned on finding out which of them it was, or if it was something different entirely. Keeping his noise levels at a minimum, Kokichi left the main hallway to all the guest suites, tiptoeing his way towards his usual partner in crime when his dice members weren't available. As the distance between them got smaller and smaller, Kokichi couldn't help but have a sneaking suspicion that there was something wrong. He couldn't quite tell if it was a big deal or not, but there was definitely something. Kokichi even decided to just walk normally, noticing how Rantaro didn't even react. He was completely out of it. There's no way he hasn't actually heard him, right? By now, Rantaro should have spun around and teased him for sneaking up on him so badly, which he totally doesn't do. He's amazing at stealth. But having the other not even react was a big concern for Kokichi. He wondered what he should do. Does he speak? Does he stand beside him? Whatever he does, he knew he would probably scare the adventurer one way or another. At least if he spoke, Rantaro couldn't assume that some rando had came over. "Taro?" The uncharacteristically acting boy visibly jumped out of his skin, but kept his back to Kokichi. Nor did he say anything in response to the Supreme Leader's concerned greeting, the small boy moving to stand beside him. It didn't even take longer than a second for a choked gasp to leave Kokichi's throat, almost wanting to clasp a clammy hand over his mouth to hide his reaction, swallowing back whatever words he wanted to say to the boy in blue and black. Rantaro, in the most blunt way possible, was fucked up. Kokichi could see each rip on his long-sleeved t-shirt, cuts of various sizes, visible through the damaged material. He had his left arm holding onto the horizontal metal pole, probably for stability, whilst his right one was wrapped around his stomach, obviously using it to put pressure on a stomach wound of some kind. How Kokichi hadn't noticed the raggedness of Rantaro's clothes would be an unsolved mystery. Bruises coated his knuckle, a trail leading up to his wrist, whilst a massive chunk of missing fabric by his ribs showed off the worst one of the lot. Even after scanning his fucked-up body, Rantaro was still smiling. How? Why? Actually, Kokichi had a better question. Why wasn't he a doctor? "You know," he started with, hunching over as he coughed up nothing, his hand's grip instantaneously getting tighter as his legs gave way a little. "Rantaro!" Kokichi was quick to wrap his arms around his torso for some support. "This could be much worse, in a way." He sounded breathy, almost like he was slowly but surely on the verge of collapsing. But it still had that calm tone to it. How could he even be calm right now? Did he think this was all going to be okay if he just stood there bleeding? Kokichi couldn't just stand and watch this, draping Rantaro's arms over his shoulders. This was probably the only way Kokichi would be able to carry Rantaro to a more suitable area right now, even if he got blood smeared all over his clothes. That's beyond the point. Have you seen yourself?" Kokichi didn't want to shout, not wanting to alarm the others whilst they rested, but at the same time, he couldn't help it. He thought that it was only natural to react the way he did. Rantaro didn't even look surprised when the smaller boy of the two had raised his voice at him, a sad smile playing on his lips. If that was meant to comfort Kokichi, Rantaro would have to try harder than that right now. "Why aren't you with a doctor or in a hospital?" he sputtered out, opting to just walk him to the boat owner's ensuite. Well, he says that, but it turns out to be more like carrying instead of walking. The adventurer's legs are too shaky for the fast-paced strides of Kokichi's legs. He wasn't bothered, however. No, there wasn't time for all this dawdling about, so he would gladly carry him to his room. The longer this took, the more Rantaro would lose himself to the blood loss. Kokichi couldn't be having that now, could he? Arriving at the ensuite in a time Kokichi considered too slow, Kokichi was quick to jump down Rantaro's throat for answers. Simple questions at first, deeper ones later. He would find out who had done this to Amami, one way or another. After ushering Rantaro into the bed, Kokichi darted into the bathroom and into the cupboard where the greenette supposedly kept his medical supplies. He frantically shoved all of the shit he didn't need out of the way, gripping onto a box. This looked like the thing. He would just have to hope it had everything he needed inside. Grabbing a folded-up cloth, too, and a cup of water, Kokichi hurried back into the bedroom, noticing how Rantaro had made himself comfortable on a towel, his long-sleeved shirt folded up next to him. Kokichi quickly shook his head. Now wasn't the time for his mind to get caught in the wrong place. He had an injured body to take care of, after all. Kokichi sat on Rantaro's thighs, making sure to keep himself a safe distance away from the stomach wound. Once he sorted that one out, he'd move a bit further up, just to make this easier on his small limbs. He noticed that the bleeding had fortunately stopped almost everywhere, only small traces and dry smears left on his body. Wipes would be a good start, though it was important he cleaned them all. There was no denying the fact that his stomach was the worst one of the lot, and needed to be tended to first. "What even happened to you?" He wanted all the details. He didn't want some smart-ass answer. He needed to know who should be put on his hit list. He needed the best description Rantaro could make, almost like this was a crime scene of some sort, wanting justice for the victim. Ironic when you remember the kind of guy Kokichi is. Just got into a bit of a... Rantaro cut himself off with a hiss, a quiet "sorry" being mumbled between his sentence. "Of a situation. Nothing interesting." Of course, that was what he'd say. He knew Rantaro would belittle his appearance, almost as if it didn't look like an assassination attempt of some sort. A messy assassin, mind you. "Don't give me that. I need details. Now, I'll ask you again. What happened to you, Rantaro?" Kokichi was a bit more stern with his words this time, disregarding the first of many wipes to the side, grabbing a gauze pad and the bandages. He knew what he was doing. Sort of. He had read enough online to assume that what he was doing was correct enough. Rantaro simply sighed, bringing the back of his hands up to his forehead, one of the few places that weren't stained in ruby red. "I was trying to find my sister, as you know, and I did. But it didn't exactly go to plan, and I ended up with, let's just say an angry mob of people. I mean, I suppose I'm not really surprised, but it still stings," he explained, leaving out all the conversations for the sake of his own mental state. Kokichi had finally finished the process, gliding his fingers up to a set of deep bruises by his ribs, making sure he didn't press onto them too hard. They looked bad. He was more than certainly gonna have to go to a hospital in the morning. "You knew?" Kokichi whispered, his blood boiling. He knew. And yet, he didn't bother to say a word to the rest of them. He didn't bother to tell them about the possible outcome of this search in particular. Kokichi wasn't sure if he was annoyed at Rantaro and his stupid, selfish but selfless behavior, or his sister for inflicting this much damage onto her own brother. It almost felt as though, surely she didn't blame Rantaro for what had happened all those years ago. Surely not. If anything, they should be thankful he cares enough to search the entire world for them. The only person they should be upset with, in Kokichi's opinion, is their own father. Kokichi had never been fond of him, ever since they met. If he truly cared about his own children, he should be here too. But he wasn't. He was MIA. He was the one to blame. It was more like a sneaking suspicion. Like, the most recent lead I got made me assume she was with some bad people, but I guess I just didn't want to believe it. Rantaro lifted his upper body, so that he could sit up straight, putting one arm in front of him, as if to prompt Kokichi to move onto that area of his body. If the blackish purple-haired boy were honest, he almost forgot that he still needed to do all this. Continuing where he left off, Kokichi began cleaning up the adventurer's arm, probably gripping onto an unwounded section a bit too hard. "Why didn't you tell us? Or at least warn us? Or even take one of us with you? I would have went with you if you told us this was most likely going to happen," Kokichi asked, almost hoping he would be able to interrogate an answer out of the greenette, though Kokichi was almost certain of the answer he'd get. A small, hopeful part of him wanted to hear something else instead. Moving over to his other arm. "Just why? You could have gotten yourself killed, you know. How long have you been bleeding like this? Are you even aware of your state right now?" He had just simply smiled, much to Kokichi's annoyance, and stared right into the smaller one's eyes. The Supreme Leader was surprised he even managed to hold eye contact for longer than a second. This wasn't his sort of thing. "And have to risk these kinds of things happening to you as well? No, I can't. I care about you too much for that." Kokichi stopped what he was doing, forming that all but same eye contact again, his grip loosening. Though most of his questions were left unanswered, it was almost like he had forgotten about them within seconds. He stared him down, almost wishing he would detect a lie. There? No. He must have meant in general. He must have been talking about all of them, not just him. There was no way he meant that. It was... No, he couldn't have. But the boy didn't show anything. His eyes were softly honest, almost like they were trying to assure Kokichi that what he had just uttered out was the honest truth. It was almost... What you... Stop staring at me like that!" Kokichi stuttered out almost abruptly, slapping a hand above Rantaro's eyes. A soft chuckle came from the taller man, a teasing smile on his face. God, Kokichi felt so warm. It was weird. Though he was capable of being warm, of course, he had never felt it in a way like this before. It was unnatural and weird. But he didn't hate it entirely. It was a warmth that made his heart skip a beat, and his cheeks feel the heat. "Are you blushing?" Rantaro's voice fitted the tease still glimmering in his eyes behind the Supreme Leader's hand, pulling Kokichi out of his internal crisis. Did he just say, blushing? No. No. Kokichi does not do that kind of thing. There was no way he was blushing right now. Though it was the most logical answer right now to his inner thoughts, Kokichi didn't want to believe it. There was just no way in hell he was blushing right now. Blushing over the simple sight of Rantaro's eyes, showing all the care in the world for him. Rantaro's much bigger hand grabbed his, the feeling slightly weird, with all the dry and sticky blood traces, but Kokichi didn't complain, pulling it away so that his deep green eyes could answer his own question. There, dusted on pale cheeks, was a light pink blush. It was adorable. It suited Kokichi's innocent face, almost as if it was made just for him. "No, I'm not. You're seeing things. You're the one blushing. Me? Blush? Never. Don't you know who I am? I'm the ultimate Supreme Leader, and Kokichi's first thought that came to mind was how soft Rantaro's lips were. Soft like a marshmallow. It seemed almost cautious in a way, almost as if the initiator didn't know if he were allowed to do this or not. Kokichi wasn't quite sure what he should do. He had never done this before. He didn't know how to reciprocate the action properly. All these feelings and romantic gestures lost on his mind. He just did what he thought was kissing the boy back once his initial shock had passed. Well, the shock never did pass. It was his aflame-lit core doing all the speaking, taking the lead, whilst his brain caught up with the scenario he was in. It almost felt like one of those scenes you'd read online. Actually, it felt scarily similar. Kokichi had wondered if he were just in the thick of a dream. He wondered if his eyes would suddenly open, and he'd be back in his room again. And he's never hoped so much in his life that that wasn't the case. His free hand draped itself over Rantaro's shoulder, feeling all the scars in various sizes that were forever etched into his skin. It was almost like his body was a canvas, and each scar was an erased pencil line. No matter how hard he tried, it would always simply be there, ready to remind him about either all the pain or happiness he's gone through. Kokichi would know. In a slow motion, those slim fingers crept to the back of Rantaro's neck and into that teal-green hair. Finally, Kokichi found out how the strands of hair felt. If he thought his lips were soft, then he needs to think of an even better word for his hair. The boy leaned into the kiss with a sigh, a sweet whine following when their lips parted. Kokichi had followed through when Rantaro drew back, the latter letting out a small chuckle at the sight. "I didn't say you could stop, did I?" Kokichi mumbled, pressing their noses together. He had wanted to initiate their second romantic interaction, but he wasn't entirely sure how. So this would have to do, lips almost touching, brushing against one another at the slightest of movements. "My lungs did." With a roll of his eyes, Kokichi pressed their two mouths together again, this time showing his usual enthusiasm he carries around in his day-to-day life. It was almost addictive, Kokichi thought. Sure, whenever he was out with dice, being a public menace to society, or even robbing banks, that's a lie though, made his heart rush with adrenaline. But this? Nothing could compare to this. Never has he been so lost in a moment, the outside world turning into a mere concept. Nothing, and he means nothing at all, could ruin this. Every beat of his heart felt like a whole new feeling, serotonin filling his brain. Even if the second kiss only lasted a few seconds longer than the first, Kokichi still felt like he was on top of the world. His supreme leader title meant nothing right now. Even without it, the blackish-purple-haired boy still felt as though he owned the world. Actually, the world sat right in front of him. His world. Kokichi took this time apart to slide off Rantaro's thighs before he got way too tempted again, taking the other's hand so that he held them both and gently tugged on them to prompt his mind. Rantaro simply followed, letting the shorter one of the two wash their hands. After all, having dry blood on them still for this long was disgusting enough as it was. "Tomorrow morning? Promise me we'll go see a doctor?" Kokichi mumbled, as he leant into a much broader chest beside him, rubbing the inner mental of his, maybe partner's, rings. They would need to discuss that tomorrow too. Rantaro had gathered all of the accessorized metal from Kokichi's hands and left them beside the faucet of the sink. He could always clean those himself later. For now, there was only one thing the adventurer had wanted to do. To say Rantaro hasn't had the same thought as Kokichi when they kissed would be a total lie, evident by the fact that he had initiated their third of the night. With precise control and footwork, Rantaro had managed to get the two of them back into his bedroom. Kokichi didn't really stand on his feet at one point, sitting the smaller boy on the bed as they broke apart. "I promise, Kichi. Now, let me put some better clothes on. Do you want anything?" Kokichi simply requested a long t-shirt, knowing that it would probably cover the boy's legs perfectly fine with the size difference between the two of them. The fabric felt good against his skin, and Kokichi was glad he had been offered something clean. Not that he didn't like his own clothes, they were just a little too red right now. The Supreme Leader followed Rantaro's lead as he laid down, visibly unsure as to what he should do with his arms. Here. Luckily for him, he had the adventurer take control, soon ending up with his arms wrapped around him, slightly laying on top of him. Does it hurt? Kokichi didn't want to accidentally make Rantaro uncomfortable for the sake of his own comfort, but with a reassuring smile, and Rantaro even snuggling into Kokichi like a cat rubbing its head against its owner's legs, he assured the slim-framed boy that he was all but uncomfortable right now. If your eyes were to focus on the greenette laying beside him, you'd be in paradise. Your jaw would drop, and your brain would only be able to put together incoherent sentences before the words, "utterly perfect," would escape your lips. Kokichi would know.